Sometimes white flowers can feel intimidating to paint, but today I'll show you how to make them pop. Welcome to Sunlit Brushstrokes. Together, we're going to be using some masking techniques along with a soft, wet-on-wet watercolor background to highlight these delicate snowdrops. Whether you're a beginner or looking to expand your watercolor pencil skills, this step-by-step tutorial will help bring your winter flowers to life. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm looking at my reference photo and just kind of using it as a guide. However, I am taking some artistic license and I'm going to be throwing 3 snowdrop flowers in here. And so I'm trying to figure out how I want to place things. I've kind of already worked the composition out ahead of time, so I'm not minding the fact that I'm going directly onto my watercolor paper. And I am using Arches cold press, and this is 140 pound. And so I'm just kind of drawing in the base. I guess you could say it is the base of the flower, but it's upside down, right? And so I'm drawing those in, those little cap shapes, and then the snowdrop shape, or I should say almost a teardrop shape that creates the petals for these leaves. So I'm going to be doing about 3 of those for each flower, and I am definitely looking at my reference photo to figure out where the outside of these little petals are and where the inside is, and just drawing the shapes that I see in the reference photo more or less for these first 2 flowers. You can see I work rather tentatively at first, just almost like in a really sketchy way to make sure I'm happy with my placement. And with this one, I've decided to slightly tweak the outside petal, the one that's the most, or I should say the one that's the furthest on the right, because I kind of don't quite like how much it's sticking out. And so I'm just taking a little artistic license here and tweaking it to make a shape that I'm kind of happier with. But really, it's totally good to just copy the photo. That's usually what I would recommend. But once you feel comfortable enough, you can tweak things a little bit to your liking. And so that's what I'm doing here. And then I'm using another reference photo to try and just figure out how I'm going to draw this 3rd flower in. I'm making it a little more closed. But if you would prefer, I have a printable outline of this on my Etsy shop. And so you can go ahead and download it and just trace this to your watercolor paper or transfer it. I will have one that's a little bit larger as well as one that's card size. And so you can just skip this stage altogether, look at the timestamps on this video, and just jump right ahead into the painting stage if that's what you prefer. Then for the leaves and stems, I'm really just kind of inventing these as I go because I wanted to just get a few in and I want them to be a little bit more simplified than what I'm seeing in the reference photo. And so I'm just kind of going in there and just drawing some nice long leaves and drooping one of them over here so that I can kind of make it look like it's folded almost. And you'll see as I paint it how I'm going to create that effect. So I'm just playing around with my leaves, and you can see I am not 100% happy yet, so I'm erasing as I decide, you know what, I'm going to change things up a little bit. So I'm just tilting that one a little and then just working out these little stems and overlapping leaves kind of in the background. I'm trying to kind of think that I have a stem for each of these little flowers, and I don't want to overdo the leaves because I don't want it to get too busy. However, I want to make sure I have enough that I'm happy with it. So I think that's going to work. So then what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually use masking fluid today. And I've got a toothpick here and I'm just dipping into my masking fluid. I have a small amount in a lid and I am using the toothpick because it's going to allow me to get a nice fine line for these stems. And so you can see I just keep dipping in and then placing it on my stems. And the thing I really like about a toothpick is that it's going to allow me to get a nice fine tip at the ends of these skinny leaves. And I really like that effect. I will later on grab a brush, but for the beginning, I'm just going around with my toothpick, dipping in, and it's sort of hard to see things with them being so fine right now. But once I finally peel that masking fluid off, you're gonna see how well this actually worked. The other really nice thing about a toothpick, besides the fact you can get a nice point, is that you don't have to wash it. You can just throw it out when you're done. And so I often do just resort to using a toothpick when I'm using masking fluid. The other thing I've decided to do is just do an outline of masking fluid around these little flowers. So I'm not actually masking the whole flower, but I'm really just creating an outline. You can do whatever you want. These are small enough, these flowers, that you could really just grab a paintbrush and mask the whole flower. But I saw another artist on YouTube, Liesel from Liesel's Artistic Studio, did an outline on her flowers, and I thought that was a perfect way to mask. And so that's what I'm doing here, as I'm just going to go ahead and put my masking fluid around the outside of my flowers as well. And that's going to come in really handy when I go to paint in my background. Finally, I'm gonna go grab a cheap brush. You don't wanna use an expensive brush for this stage. I'm gonna grab a cheaper brush and just rub it into some soap to protect it against the masking fluid. Then I'll just dab off the excess on a tissue here. And then finally, I'll dip it into my masking fluid and just quickly go ahead and paint these leaves. And I ended up covering each of these leaves completely, and I'm actually really glad I did because it really made it a lot easier when I went and painted the background. So once you've got that masking fluid on there, you're gonna wanna let things completely dry before the next stage. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry and I'll be back. So first I'm going ahead with my water and filling in the background with this nice soft brush. I do like the Artegria brushes because they hold a lot of water and they're just really nice for watercolor. And because I'm using regular traditional watercolor for my background, I'm just gonna go in and fill the background area with water. And once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and start dropping in my blues. And because I didn't mask my petals, I am going to at least want to be conscious of not dropping water into them. Otherwise, everything else is masked, and so that will make the background pretty straightforward and easy. And one thing to note is that I'm not bringing my water to the very, very edges of the paper. I'm leaving approximately at least 1/4 of an inch all the way around so that I kind of have a nice rough organic looking, if you will, edge to my painting. And you're going to see how that comes together when I add my blue. And for my blue today, I mainly am using phthalo blue, and I'm just dropping that color right into my wet background. So like I say, you don't have to even wet to the very edges of the painting. You just have to be conscious of how things are coming as you work up there. And then I'm just going around, sometimes with a little more water on my brush, sometimes with a little bit more paint, and just filling this whole background in. And yeah, you can see I'm pretty dry up at the top there. But if you work fast enough, that works completely fine. So I'm just kind of rubbing this around, and I'm working a little bit lighter. I want to make sure that I don't end up with filling in any of these sections where they're too deep and darker blue. So sometimes I'm moving that around, as you can see me doing there, lifting, moving it. You really don't want to end up with like a dark puddle in that little section, because the masking fluid's almost creating a little bit of a fence for the paint, if you will, and it's holding it in there. So that's something to be aware of, that even though I've put the masking fluid on there, I want to create the look that the background wash is just completely flowing from one section to the next. Then I grabbed a little bit of quinacridone rose to make my blue a little bit more purple, and so I'm dropping that in as well, especially kind of at the lower sections of the painting. Maybe lower center is where I'm really aiming to get more of that nice purple hue. And once again, I want to make sure that I create the look that's kind of flowing throughout the painting. I don't want any of the masked sections to end up being like a dark shape that's kind of isolated. So when I drop my color, I'm going to want to make sure that I have that same color kind of flow really both sides of any shape, like both sides of the stem or both sides of the leaf, whatever it is. And right now it does look a little dark in the middle. I'm going to be fixing that. Just lift it a little bit out there and just drop a little bit more in a few places here. And at this point, I'm sort of just playing until I get it the way I want it to look. And now I'm going ahead and I'm applying a bit more watery paint everywhere, just because I feel like things are drying and I want to make sure that I don't get hard edges. So I'm just going in with some more water on my brush, a little bit of paint, and I'm just really smoothing the paint out, if you will, because I am concerned I'm going to end up with some hard edges. So I just want to make sure everything's still wet. If you've got enough water on here to start with and you move fast enough, that won't be a problem. But I feel like for me, things are starting to dry out. And so I just added a little more water, and then I'm coming back in and just, again, playing with my paint. I'm probably starting to overwork it here, but I am wanting to get things just a smidgen bit darker, especially kind of behind the flowers and the leaves. I'm kind of creating almost like a diagonal look back here. But again, now you can finally see the connection, right, that's happening in the background. I want to have it look like that dark section is just completely behind everything and just flowing smoothly, and I don't have things like being chopped up by my masking fluid. And so I feel like this is really helping. And the reason I wanted a more purple color kind of behind my leaves is that the purple has a little bit of red in it, and the red actually complements that green really nicely, and so it just gives a little more contrast than if I was only using blue. I decided to come in with more colors still because I really wanted to make these leaves pop. That's totally optional. Like I say, I think I'm maybe picking a little bit more than I have to with my background. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to let everything completely dry. And then I'm going to come in and start picking out my masking fluid. So to get that off, I'm just using first an eraser to kind of get things starting to rub off, and then I'm using my finger to rub the rest of it off. And sometimes, as you can see, you can even like almost just pull it and it will just kind of peel off. You can also buy a masking fluid remover. It's kind of like an eraser that will help you lift this off, and you can use that as well. I've never actually owned one. I just tend to use my fingers and eraser and just kind of play at it and pick at it, but you can definitely do what works for you. So once I've got all this off of here, I will be back. All right, let's quickly talk about our colors. So for my watercolor pencils, I have a nice bright green, then a middle green, and finally a nice dark green. And for my blues, I have one that's a little bit more like a dark royal blue, and then one that's a nice dark navy blue. It's called indigo. So I'm just laying these on here and adding some water just so you have an idea of what I'm using if you want to find colors that are similar to what I'm using. So I'm starting out with my blue that's kind of more the royal blue color here. And I'm just going around slightly, ever so slightly outlining these little petals. And then I'm looking at the reference photo to see where I'm seeing those nice deep shadows. And so you can see, looking at the photo, things are really nice and dark on the inside of each of these little petals. And so the inside of the petal is definitely darker as it comes towards the top because the light's being blocked from it. And so that's where I'm making my shadows the darkest and the deepest. So I'm using the same pencil here everywhere, and I'm just changing my pressure. So when I want a deeper shadow, I'm pushing a little harder, and then a lighter shadow, I'm pushing a little lighter. And again, I just keep looking at that reference photo because I'm really wanting to just use that as my guide. And if you use a reference photo as a guide, you're going to be amazed at how realistic you can get your work to look. That's what I would highly recommend doing, especially if you're a beginner, but even through any stage of your art journey, using a reference photo is the best way to get results that you love. Now I did use another reference photo to kind of help me with this other one, but the light source was slightly different in it, so I'm kind of taking a bit of artistic license. And that's something that's a little bit more challenging sometimes at the beginning of your art journey. However, if you kind of just keep in mind the way the shadows were working on those other flowers, then you should be able to just kind of almost copy that concept onto this one. So that's what I'm doing. I'm, pushing my shadows a little darker once again on the inside of these petals. And it seems to me that the light source is coming from above, and so there isn't necessarily a really, really strong light versus dark side to these flowers. I would just say the dark is really inside the petals. So I decided to push it a little further, or the shadows a little further, with my indigo blue. So I've put a tiny little bit of that in there. Then I'm going to grab my water and I'm going to start the blending process. So I'm coming into this first shape over here, starting in the lightest areas where I don't really have much pigment, and I'm just dropping some water in, and then as I pick up pigment on my brush, I'm dabbing my brush off a little bit on my paper towel just to kind of help control the water. This is going to keep it from getting too wet and having things blend too much. Here I've managed to obliterate my whites, and so I'm coming in with a thirsty brush. So my brush, I wash first in water, dab it on a paper towel, and then come in and kind of almost lift that paint out so that I gain my whites back because they were disappearing on me. I definitely went overboard with those shadows. Now I'm wetting this front petal that's completely looking white right now, and I'm going to try and drag some of my color that's on my brush. So I'll like pick some up out of this section here and then drop it into my white section. Sometimes it can work well to pick up pigment from your darker sections and just gently bring them into your lighter areas so that you don't need to put a lot of pigment into your whites. And so that's what I'm doing to start with here, but you're gonna see later on, I do end up dropping, or I should say even just drawing a few of these details in with my watercolor pencil, just because I feel like I'm not quite getting as much detail on my little petals as I would like to. So what I'm really doing is just wetting that petal and then dragging, or I should say picking up a little bit of the dark pigment from my darker shadow sections of my flower and dropping them in a kind of linear pattern. I want to create the effect of the creases and the folds that I'm seeing in these little petals. However, like I said, I will be defining that a little bit more with my watercolor pencil later. And so you really don't have to do that right now if you don't want to, or if you want to experiment and play with this technique. It is one I do really like. I just find I'm not getting quite enough detail. Part of it is that I am kind of wet and there is a certain amount of like dryness to the paper that you're going to want to do this technique. And if your paper is too wet, things will blend out a little bit too much. You can see I've got a really, really nice soft kind of look right now, but like I say, we are going to go ahead and throw in more pencil in a little bit here. Because I had put a tiny little bit of watercolor pencil there to kind of define or separate that front flower from the back one, I'm able to just wet that watercolor pencil and you can right away see that petal is getting pushed, or I should say that flower is getting pushed behind the one in front of it. So that's working nicely. So in the meantime, I'm just going to come in and finish these shadow shapes in the flowers. And that was a dumb decision right here because my petals, both petals beside it were wet. And so things started to bleed more than I wanted them to. So I'm just quickly kind of using a thirsty brush, clean, dry my brush, wipe out that pigment. And I'm gonna have to come in and do that section again because as you can see, everything kind of just mushed together. And that's actually just a helpful thing to know. Sometimes you accidentally do that. You make a decision to like wet shapes that are side by side each other when you really didn't want to. And so color ends up bleeding in from one shape to the next and you kind of like almost start losing your shapes like what's just happened. The best thing really is to just lift that excess color out, whether that's with a thirsty brush or even just sometimes just a gentle blot with a paper towel to kind of remove excess pigment. Let it dry and so that it looks lighter than you want it to look because you can always darken things. It's a lot harder to come in later and lighten. So that's what I've done here. I'm gonna go ahead, let it dry, and then I can come back in with watercolor pencil and redefine things. So I've got my watercolor pencil again. This is my indigo blue and my paper is dry. So now you can see I'm trying to create those nice soft creases and folds in the white sections of these petals. And I think it's working well with the watercolor pencil. Then I can redefine or repair this section here. And as you can see, just pushing a little harder with that watercolor pencil in my shadow sections. It's just bringing them back to life. I'm going to do that a little bit everywhere where I've kind of lifted some of my shadows to use that as my pigment. So I'm just coming in a little bit of indigo blue everywhere. Maybe the flower above is casting a little bit of a shadow, and that's going to help push this little one a little bit further back so that it doesn't pop out as much. Then I'm going to come in and just darken my nice little shadow shapes again, since I've got fresh pigment on there. And because everything's really dry, I'm actually working on this light petal, even though it is touching the shape I just did, the wet one. Because I don't have much water on my brush to blend these little folds out, I can get away with it in this situation. Then I'm going to come in and do this little shape here. And like I say, I am doing shapes that are touching, but because I'm working so dry, that center petal there, that white one, is really not wet enough to have things bleed. So I'm going to be okay. And with this, I'm wetting the lighter section of this little underside of the petal first, and then coming up into my shadows. And if I feel like I want to lift a little bit of that shadow color out, I just use my thirsty brush, lift it out. And then on this petal, I'm going to define it a little bit. Things are a little bit jagged looking there from how I mask things. And so I'm just putting a little bit of that shadow color there to kind of create a nice smooth edge. So first with the watercolor pencil and then with my paintbrush and just smoothing it out. I'm doing the same thing on this one. And like I say, because I'm working pretty dry, I think I can get away with doing inside of this here. Let's see. Yeah, I think we're okay. Like I say, I'm working quite dry. My brush is really not too wet right now, which means I'm not going to get as much of a watercolor look. I'm going to have more detail, but that's what I'm after right now. I want a little bit of detail in these petals. So I'm getting away with doing one petal that's touching another. And that's something you're just going to have to kind of get a feel for. As you could tell earlier, I made things mush together because I was too wet. But now that I'm working fairly dry, I can work with one shape that's touching the next. So I'm just going to go around and just gently blend the tiny bit of pigment that I have on this lower one, just in the white sections for now. I think it won't be good to keep blending there. I think those shapes there will end up kind of mushing together. So let's skip the rest of the petals for now, and I'm going to go ahead and start working on the greens and just fill all of these in with this nice bright green. So I'm going to do that. And I do apologize that that lower portion of the stems and leaves is cut off right now in the camera. I eventually will notice, but I am sorry it is cut off for a little while here. But all I'm doing right now is just going ahead and basically coloring. So I think it's fairly straightforward. And I'm noticing my pencil sometimes catches on tiny crumbs of masking fluid that are still left behind. So I'm just rubbing those off as I go. That might be something you run into a little bit as well, but it's easy to fix. Everything's dry, so you can just kind of rub, keep coloring. And like I say, I'm not really doing anything to create too much definition here. And so I'll just finish coloring this layer in with my light green, and then I'll be back to add my darks. All right, so I've got a darker green now, and I'm gonna just put a little bit of that at the tip of my leaves. And then as well, where the leaves kind of overlap, where one leaf is in front of another one, the one that's behind is going to be darker where the edges meet. Same thing where this fold is happening. Again, the part that's underneath or a little bit behind is going to be darker where the edges meet. Same thing is going to happen with this one, and it's going to be hard to define it with just my dark green, and so I am going to be coming back in and adding some darker colors here to create more definition where these kind of cross over like this. So let's grab that indigo blue, and the indigo blue is going to push that very back one even further back. Okay, back to my green, and I'm going to just keep defining these. Anytime that one stem is behind another, I'm darkening where the edges meet. And then when I'm doing these tiny little caps here, I'm going to do darker around the outside edges of them, definitely along the bottom because they're more shaded. And then when I come to these nice drooped over stems, I'm going to do the underside darker than the upper side, right? Because the sun is coming from above very clearly in this photo, and so I'm darkening the undersides of these little stems. And even though there's not a really definite left versus right side light source, I decided to just go ahead, take artistic license, and make the left side of my stems slightly darker than the right side, just so they had a little bit more definition to them. So that was just an artistic choice there I made. And while I'm at it, I'm going to harmonize things by dropping a little bit of that green into the inside shadow sections of my little flowers, just so I create harmony, because then I'll go ahead and grab my indigo blue and pull a little bit of that indigo blue into the shaded parts of my green. So just In some areas where I've already applied dark green, I'm just putting a tiny hint of indigo blue, and that's just going to push the shadows a bit further. And I'm going to do the same thing as I kind of come to the base of these flowers. I'm just darkening things just a little bit, pulling them right to the bottom of my little painting here. Okay, so now that everything is dry, I'm gonna come in here and just blend these little petals just a tad bit more, because as you know, I threw that tiny bit of green in there. So I'm just doing a really quick blending of these shadow sections of the flowers. And even though you can't see that green very well, it is creating a little bit of harmony in the painting. So I'm happy I added it, but it's kind of optional. I do think it's pushing those shadows a little bit deeper and darker as well. So I'm happy with them. And I'm using just the tip of my brush to blend those out. It's very tiny shapes we're working with here. Finally, I'm blending these little dark shapes. We haven't done that yet. So just, again, using my damp brush and just gently blending those out. Let's try this one. I have to be pretty careful here that I don't mush my shapes together, but I do like how this is pushing the little flower kind of behind the one above it. That darkness, again, where the edges meet, just helps to push that flower back. All right, let's go to the greens, and I'm starting where it's lightest and then working my way into the darker sections. So the center of this was lighter, and then as you see, the sides, as you know, we put a little more dark green. So I'm just blending that out. And that's the general rule of watercolor pencil, is to work from light to dark. And now I'm just taking like a single stroke or two down these stems with my damp brush, just to kind of blend them out. I don't want to over blend. So if I end up with some areas that are a little bit too light and maybe haven't got blended quite enough, I'm not going to worry about it. I'll come in and just tweak them at the very end, because I really would prefer not to over blend. I want to keep that definition of a lighter side and a darker side to my little stems. So same thing with the leaf here, always starting in the light and then coming into my darks. And then I wash and dry my brush before I come back down. And so I kind of am starting again in my light area and dragging things into my dark. So there's a lot of like washing my brush, drying my brush, and coming back into the light sections throughout this stage of the painting. Really, anytime you're using watercolor pencil, you're going to be wiping or washing and drying your brush quite a lot. Doing that's going to prevent things from being over blended looking and from blending your darks into your lights. So I'm doing the same thing with the stems, as you can see, just trying to take a single pass or two, not overworking. I'm almost pushing it there, but let's go and do this stem. So I'm doing this stem. I had decided to make it come forwards, or so that it's more towards us. So I'm going to blend it first, and it's lighter because it's at the front. So I'm just blending things, again, light to dark, and then I'll leave it alone and come to these other ones that aren't touching it. So I'm going to do this underside here of this particular leaf. Just blending those darks into the light ever so slightly. You want to have a lot of control here. Now I have to figure out where else to go that's not touching anything that's wet. So these little pieces here, I can go ahead and blend them, and that's not going to blend into any wet shapes. I think I'm going to have to go ahead and grab the hairdryer, and then I'll be back. Do you enjoy working in watercolor pencil? If so, I think you'll be interested in my free 2-part pencil technique mini workshop. Whether you're looking for ways to add texture to your work, or if you simply enjoy coloring and would like to add dimension to your coloring pages, this workshop is for you. You can even apply many of these techniques to graphite pencil or other dry media. I'll share examples of how I apply these techniques to inspire you with ideas for your own artwork. You can sign up for this workshop at the link in the description below. Now back to today's video. All right, everything is dry now, so I can come back in and do these back little stems and leaves. And as you can see, I went darker when I colored here. I used a little bit more dark with my pencil to darken where those edges are meeting. And as I blend it, you can really see the front stem pops because the back leaf is a little bit darker where it's meeting that front stem, right? And so you can see me going around. And again, the back stems, I've made them a little bit darker than the front stems. And as I said, that's especially important just where those edges are meeting each other. You don't have to darken the whole stem. All right, I'm just gonna come in here and just softly lift and blend a little bit in here. Just make sure I'm happy with it. And then I can do this leaf here as well. It's not touching anything that's wet, so let's do that. Again, light, and then blend into my darks. You can see how that really comes to life once we wet that watercolor pencil, hey? All right. I'm coming in and just looking if there's any areas that look a little bit white still, maybe where I didn't blend thoroughly earlier. So I'm just gonna come in with a damp brush and just gently blend. And that's gonna allow me to just repair the areas that are looking just a little smidgen like a speck of white, if I wanna get rid of that speck of white, without blending the whole leaf or stem right out. Finally, I dried it and I'm coming in to do these last few shapes. Following my same technique of working from light to dark. And now you can see how that back stem is really receding from us because I put that dark indigo on there, and as I blend it, it just gets nice and dark and rich, and it really does give that impression, doesn't it, that that leaf is behind the one in front of it. If you enjoy working in watercolor pencils, you might want to check out my watercolor pencil playlist for more tips and inspiration. In the meantime, I hope this tutorial has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye!